What's up, and welcome to Chapter 26 of AMSCO U.S. History, Truman and the Cold War. Please make sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and like, comment, and share these videos with your friends. Thanks! Following World War II, there were two main superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Truman, the President of the United States, wanted to limit the Soviets and their communist ideals. He asked Congress in March of 1947 for money to aid two countries, Greece and Turkey, against revolutions in their nations. He wanted the United States to put resources to go against these totalitarian regimes, which were usually communists, and Soviets who were trying to turn these new countries communist. It gained bipartisan support from both Republicans and Democrats in Congress. More broadly, Truman's idea was about containing Soviet aggression. The Containment Policy, as it was called, governed U.S. foreign policy for decades that followed, and was formulated by many senior officials, the most notable George F. Kennan. Kennan was an expert on Soviet affairs, and he wrote that the only way to counter these Russian expansive tendencies was to always be patient and vigilant against the spread of communism. And eventually, this would cause the Soviets to back off their communist ideology of world domination. Basically, people wanted to not have communist appeasement as they did with the fascists in Germany. They wanted to limit the scale of communism so that it would never grow to be what the Nazis grew into. To make America more secure, Truman broke the tradition of entangling alliances set by George Washington and recommended the U.S. join a military defense pact of Western Europe, and the Senate agreed. Together, 10 European countries, the U.S. and Canada, created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. This was a military alliance that defended all members inside this treaty from outside attack. Truman selected General Dwight D. Eisenhower as the first Supreme Commander and stationed troops in Western Europe to guard if the Soviets ever decided to invade. It led to a big military buildup around the world, and the Soviets countered in 1955 by forming the Warsaw Pact, which was a military alliance for defending communist states of Eastern Europe. Domestically, Congress passed the pro-business TaftHartley Act, which was called a slave labor bill by some. This Republican-sponsored law overrode Truman's veto, and it wanted to check the growing power of unions. It allowed for right-to-work states where workers were allowed to directly work for a company and not need to join a union. It outlawed unions joining together against boycotts of a company. And it also allowed the president to issue a cool-off period to stop strikes from heating up too much. These unions fought unsuccessfully to repeal this Taft-Hartley Act, but they weren't successful as big business was starting to win again. It was a major dividing issue between Republicans and Democrats into the 1950s. Truman also tried to issue other reform programs. In 1949, he urged Congress to pass the Fair Deal. It was a combination of national health care insurance, federal aids to education, civil rights legislation, and other funds for public housings and farms. Conservatives in Congress, usually the Republicans, didn't like these reforms, but they did allow for an increase in the minimum wage from 40 to 75 cents an hour, and also more workers under Social Security. The reasons for defeat were because Truman did not really get along with Congress, and also foreign policy was big with the Cold War. Many people were worried more with Russian and Soviet expansion than domestic problems at home. However, it was notable that this helped to maintain New Deal reforms of FDR and also made civil rights more open in the American atmosphere. The Soviet Union was able to successfully test their first atomic bomb in 1949 with the help of spies who actually leaked secrets from the Manhattan Project. An FBI investigation traced one spy ring to Julius and Ethel Rosenberg in the Rosenberg cases. After a very controversial trial, the Rosenbergs were found guilty of treason, leaking secrets to the Soviets, and were executed. This contributed to anti-communist hysteria, where people were afraid of communism infiltrating the United States. Another notable person was Alger Hiss. He was a prominent official in the State Department who had even assisted Roosevelt at the Yalta Conference. However, people accused him of becoming a communist and giving secret documents to Whittaker Chambers, who was a confessed communist. By the prosecution of a young member of Congress named Richard Nixon, who would later become president, he was sent to prison and spent a long time in prison. This created more anti-communist hysteria as people were fearing that high levels of government were infiltrated by communist spies and that America was breaking down. Playing upon these anti-communist hysteria fears was Joseph McCarthy, a Republican senator from Wisconsin. He used these fears and communism in his re-election campaign, and specifically charged 205 communists still working in the State Department. He had sensational accusations, and the American press covered him a lot. He then rode these waves of anti-communist feelings to become one of the most powerful men in America, and people were really afraid of him because if McCarthy pointed his finger in their way, they would many times be accused and could never get their name cleared. Eventually, he was detected as a fraud, and no one really believed him and his communist accusations. The first major crisis of this Cold War focused on Berlin. Berlin was the capital of Germany, and in 1948, the Soviets cut off all access by land to the German city. So I'm going to try to draw Germany here. This is kind of like Germany after the war. And it was split right here, so that's West Germany and East Germany. And Berlin was right here in East Germany. So it was in Soviet territory, but Berlin was the capital, and so it was split in half. So Berlin's east side was also Soviet-controlled, while the west side was controlled by the Western powers, the France, United Kingdom, and the United States. And so the Soviet Union decided to block all goods from entering West Germany, and as a result, West Germany was stranded. They didn't have resources. So Truman decided he didn't want to directly bail out Berlin by force. So he sent special planes with resources over to West Berlin in an attempt to give them resources again. And this worked. Let me just erase this real quick. And these U.S. planes flew in supplies to the people of West Berlin, and this massive airlift continued for weeks. Stalin, who was the leader of the Soviet Union, decided not to challenge the airlift, and this stand helped Truman actually win re-election in 1948. By 1949, the Soviets finally opened up the highways to Berlin, ending this blockade. One major long-term consequence was the creation of two Germanys, the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, which was a combination of France, United Kingdom, and the U.S. parts of Germany. It was a U.S. ally, and also the German Democratic Republic, which would eventually become East Germany, which was a Soviet satellite, so it was allied with the Soviets. One notable thing that came out of this was the candy bomber. The candy bomber were pilots who specifically wrapped up candy and threw them outside their planes to children waiting below ground during their airlifts, and they were very popular among these children because, of course, free candy, right? This was another effect of the Berlin airlift. With the Soviets gaining the atomic bomb, Truman approved the development of a bomb that was 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb. This was the hydrogen bomb. And in 1952, it was added to the U.S. arsenal. In 1950, the National Security Council, or NSC, had recommended in a secret report known as NSC 68 that the following measures were required to fight a Cold War against the Soviets. They wanted to quadruple the U.S. government defense spending to 20% of GNP, the gross national product of a country. They also wanted to form alliances with non-communist countries around the world, such as NATO. And they also wanted to convince the American public in a propaganda machine way that a costly arms buildup was necessary for the nation's defense. If the United States didn't spend lots of money on arms, they would lose to the Soviets, and they might lose their country as well. The first big conflict and war-ish, occurred actually in Korea when the North Koreans invaded South Korea. North Korea had pushed the combined South Korean and American forces to the tip of the peninsula very early in the war. And so the U.S. sent in General Douglas MacArthur, who was also a World War II veteran, and he reversed the war with a brilliant amphibious assault at Incheon beyond the North Korean lines. So let me attempt to draw Korea here. Incheon is like right here in Korea. And this attack pushed the North Koreans all the way back to the Chinese border, so all the way up there. And the U.S. was even about to go into China. MacArthur was able to push all the way up to the Chinese border, but then the Chinese didn't like it, so they sent their own troops to push MacArthur and the UN troops back to eventually what would become known as the 38th parallel. The 38th parallel is where North and South Korea are actually split today. At the same time, MacArthur wanted to keep expanding the war, and he wanted to bomb and invade mainland China. But Truman did not like this, and when MacArthur spoke out publicly against him, he was recalled for insubordination, not listening to your senior officials. MacArthur returned home as a hero, and most Americans agreed that there was no substitute for victory. Most Americans believed that they should have completely finished the war and went all the way to the Chinese border. As such, the president's containment policy and concept of limited war in Korea was viewed as lame by the people. MacArthur was truly an American hero in the minds of many in this Cold War era. Because the United States didn't declare war, their intervention in Korea was merely called a police action, kind of like when police regulate people. In Korea, the war was stalemated, as said, along the 38th parallel, which is right here. Incheon is right there, as we mentioned. And the peace talks began in July of 1951, after war had broken out. The police action dragged on for another 2 years, and an armistice was finally signed in 1953 when Dwight D. Eisenhower was now the president. As a result, the Korean War never fully came to an end. There's just always been an armistice, even to this day. And more than 2.5 million people died in the Korean conflict, including 54,000 Americans. So it's very costly for the nation of Korea. A final thing that was passed in the United States was the McCarran Internal Security Act. It was passed by Congress, and it had 3 limitations. It made it unlawful to advocate or support the establishment of a totalitarian government in foreign countries. It restricted the employment and travel of those joining Communist Front organizations, going against the idea of communism again, and also authorized the creation of detention camps for subversives. So detention camps for communists who are trying to undermine America. Once again, we see civil rights being limited in America in this time of crisis or war, a recurring theme in American history. So this has been Chapter 26 of AMSCO U.S. History, Truman and the Cold War. Thanks so much for watching, and hope to see you in the next one.